Well, here we are in Jerusalem, and I'm sure that you've had an exciting day as I have, and some of the sights that we've seen today are quite illuminating. We were at the Shepherd's Fields today outside of Bethlehem, and that's one of the places that I was looking forward to seeing again, and it provides some illumination, does it not, on the Christmas story. I'd like to try to do a couple things this evening in our time together. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the question that's raised in Paul Copen's book, since we aren't really going to be going to sites where I think it would be provide an opportunity for me to discuss these issues with you. But nonetheless, I think it's vitally essential to touch upon the issues of the genocidal passages in the Old Testament, so-called genocidal passages, the issue of slavery, and also I'd like to talk a little bit more about the wrath of God. You know, the picture that I brought up the other night that the German higher critics raised with this angry, wrathful, vengeful, jealous God of the Old Testament. So this goes right along with Paul Copen's book. So just to sort of, by way of introduction, get you up to speed and thinking along the lines I want you to be thinking as we've been working through this, is the attempt that we've been trying to make in our visit here to close a number of gaps that exist. Thank you very much. If you recall in the introductory part of the notes, I discuss a number of gaps. One is the language gap, another is the culture gap, there's the geography gap, and then there's the history gap. And I hope that over the course of the time we've been here, you've been seeing some of those gaps begin to close. That's what coming here and studying the Bible in the Holy Land is all about. And perhaps one of the most difficult gaps to close concerns the issue of whether God is a moral monster or not. Now, I put it that way. Obviously, that's the title of Copen's book. But the thing that we really have to contend with here with regard to the apologetic aspect of this is the fact that this area of the Bible is attacked more than any other area by the critics and skeptics. If you have read any of the new atheist books, people like the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, these guys are going after this pretty consistently. And of course, when we begin to look at the text, these texts in their context, I think we begin to find some answers. Now remember that at the beginning of our first talk, I discussed with you the importance of reading the Bible in its context. And when we talk about reading the Bible literally, we need to make that distinction, the difference between naive literalism versus critical literalism. What we're trying to do with the critical literalist approach, and by critical I don't mean that in a negative way. When I use the word critical, I mean it in the way it's used in academia, in the sense that we're analyzing things carefully and trying to understand them. And so when we are approaching things that way, we are attempting to discover the author's intended meaning of a text, as well as what we might call original comprehension, how the people to whom the Bible was written to would have understood the meaning. Remember, I discussed the fallacy of presentism. I just want to remind you of that again, because I think this is the biggest error that's being made by these critics. Just by way of reminder, it's when present-day ideas and perspectives are anachronistically applied or introduced into depictions or interpretations of the past. I would suggest to you that's exactly what's going on when we talk about the question of whether God actually commanded genocide in the Old Testament. So what's really going on? You know these passages that I'm talking about in the conquest of the Promised Land, with not only with Moses but Joshua as well, and then moving further, King Saul and Samuel. We have a number of texts that talk about utterly destroying, from the eldest to the youngest, utterly destroying the animals. We have these texts that are there of certain people groups. And what I would like to suggest in line with what Paul Copan is addressing in his book is that perhaps the way we're reading that is not from the perspective of the intent of the author, and also with the way it would have been comprehended by those who would have originally read it. In other words, what perhaps is going on in these texts is the use of exclusive hyperbolic language. Now, what is hyperbolic language? Remember, we said it's a rhetorical exaggeration. That's what it is. We gave some examples the last time with respect to Jesus' statements in the New Testament, where it's used there. If anyone desires to come after me, he must hate his mother, his father, his brothers and sisters, and so on. And I suggested to you that that was hyperbolic language as well. Biblical scholars have come to recognize that this was a common way of writing in the ancient world. As I pointed out before, it was an emphasis that was given in order to help a person remember something. Particularly, we find that, I think, in the Gospels. But what about in the Old Testament? Well, in the Old Testament, we also find it being used, and it's specifically being used in war texts. In other words, texts that are talking about victory in military campaigns. We have tons of extra-biblical evidence, by the way, to support this. We find it's a common feature in ancient Near Eastern literature to describe victories in terms of exaggerations. There was a stele that was discovered that recorded, it's discovered in the ancient Near East, that was recovered, and it was referenced a Moabite king who wrote of his defeat of Israel. And on that stele, he wrote this: Israel is no more. Israel is no more. Now, obviously, Israel was not no more literally, but he was writing about his victory, his victory over the army of Israel. And this was a very common thing, a common feature that existed throughout the ancient Near East. Now, just so you can get a sense of how this is not really too far off the mark from the way we often speak, we use rhetorical exaggerations ourselves today. For example, here's one of my favorites. Nobody puts ketchup on a hot dog. Anybody know who said that? Besides me just now. Dirty Harry said that, by the way. And I think it was Magnum Force. But it's got to be true if he said it, yeah. The Apostle Paul says it in the New Testament: Cretans are always liars. We use it when we describe a victory in a sporting event. It could very easily be said when, someone could very easily say something like this when you win in a basketball game. Well, we wiped them out, right? We smeared them. We annihilated them. We do the same thing, do we not? Well, it was a common feature in the way victories were described in the ancient world to speak that way. And so if the Bible was written in human language, it would have incorporated rhetorical techniques in the time period in which it was written in order to communicate those messages that God wanted to be communicated. And so God himself would inspire that very kind of language. And I believe that that's exactly what he's doing. in a way that would have been understood by the people to whom it was written. And so let me give you a couple examples of this, and I'll provide some parallels as well that existed elsewhere. So if you want to take a look at this in your Bible, 1 Samuel 15:8, this is when King Saul went to war against the Amalekites. And now he didn't do everything he was supposed to do here, but it says in verse 8, and he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Did you catch that? Utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Now, anybody who would continue to read 1 Samuel, a few chapters later, guess who's still around? Amalekites are still around. In fact, they get utterly destroyed a number of times, but yet they still keep showing up. So what's going on here? I would suggest to you that this is the language of a military victory, that's what's really going on here. Let me give you an extra biblical reference. This is from Ramses the Third, and describing his victory over the Philistines. He says, I slew the Denyen in their islands, while the Philistines were made ashes. The Shurdan and the Washish of the sea were made non-existent. Now, if we stop there, you'd think that they were just wiped out. There's nobody left, right? Made non-existent. Made ashes, he says. But then in the very next phrase, he says, captured altogether and brought on captivity to Egypt like the sands of the shore. And what happened? I thought that he made them ashes, and they are no more. And then he talks about bringing captives back, that their number is greater than the sands of the seashore. You see you get a sense of what's going on here? It's the language of rhetorical exaggeration. It's a language of victory in a military campaign. Let me read to you a quote from Rabbani, which is in your bibliography for the course. I have this work listed. It's a book titled The Syrian Christ, and he's describing how this method, this rhetorical exaggeration, how it functioned in the ancient world and how it was used. He says, a case may be overstated or understated, not necessarily for the purpose of deceiving, but to impress the hearer with the significance or insignificance of it. If a sleeper who has been expected to rise at sunrise should oversleep and needs to be awakened, say half an hour or an hour later than the appointed time, he is then aroused with the call, arise, it is noon already. Of a strong and brave man it is said, he can split the earth. The Syrians suffer from no misunderstanding in such cases. They discern each other's meaning. What's he saying? Well, he's talking about how this was commonly used, and gives the reasons why, or the various ways in which it was used. But then he points out that the hearers of this would not be confused by this. They would understand it. They would know it because it was a part of the language, a part of how language functioned in the ancient Near East, in a similar way that it functions for us. When we hear a rhetorical exaggeration, we more than likely are going to understand it because it's a part of our culture. It's a part of the way that we speak about specific things. Now, if we constantly used it, then we would confuse a lot of people. But we know that when it's used about particular types of events that have happened, we understand it because it's commonly used in that way. Okay? Any questions up to this point? I want to move on to slavery. I'm just highlighting this. Copen goes into great detail in the book. And so I'm just scratching the surface on this. The mic is available if you have a question or a comment. Dr. Crisp.
Yes, may I add a New Testament illustration?
Please, absolutely.
For this. That relates to Israel, where we are now. When the Apostle Paul says, I am shaking the dust off of my feet, I am turning from the Jews unto the Gentiles. Many have used that as justification for saying that God is finished with the Jewish people. However, when you read the following chapters, the next town that he goes in, he goes to the synagogue, right, preaches the message, shakes his feet off again, goes to the next one. But you would think when he says, I will have nothing else to do with you, that is the end. But it is indeed not the end. It's the same kind of thing where the people in the Old Testament show up again. And it doesn't mean that he's never going to have anything to do with them. And so that's a New Testament corollary to what we've been talking about in relation to Israel.
Yeah, excellent, yes. There is an article that is included in your notes on hyperbole. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read it yet, but it talks about in the article how to recognize it, because it's not always clear. It takes a little work to try to figure some of these out. But what seems to me to be quite clear about these war texts that we find in the Old Testament is that they're not hard to figure out if we just keep reading. And when you have these new atheists, these new style critics, the way they read the Bible is they read it with the intent to find ways to criticize it, and they rip things out of context all the time. They don't care about trying to understand it. All they want to do is criticize it. And so you'll hear Sam Harris, who I heard him in a debate with William Lane Craig, and I don't know if any of you've seen it. It's on YouTube if you care to find it. When Craig had him in a corner, the debate that they were having concerned the ground. Is the ground for morality supernatural or natural, which has nothing to do with this material that I'm covering tonight. But Craig just devastated Harris's theory about that. And so what does Sam Harris do? He resorts to pulling texts out of context in the Old Testament, just throws them out there for shock value, and to try to get the audience to come to his side because he's losing the debate. It's a debate tactic. If you're in trouble, throw out a red herring and drag people in a different direction, and that's what he did. But you find these people constantly going after this stuff. But when you read, like I mentioned, the easiest way to figure this out is when you read a statement of utter destruction, and then the people are again having to go to war again against them, utter destruction again. It keeps happening. Then you begin to realize, that's hyperbole. That seems to be the best explanation for it. And if someone says, well, maybe Joshua just didn't do what he was commanded to do, well, that becomes something of a problem, because it does say that he did what he was commanded to do. In Joshua 9:24 and Joshua 11:12, it says that Joshua obeyed all that Moses commanded him to do. So he was doing what he's supposed to do. Well, what was he supposed to do? Commit genocide? No, that's not what God wasn't interested in just annihilating groups of people because they belonged to a particular race or a particular nationality. That's not what was going on. What was going on was the same thing that would happen to Israel. God said the same thing to Israel. If you don't do what I've commanded you, I'll do the same thing to you. I'll utterly destroy you. You'll be vomited out the land as well. So it was displacement. That's what it was, displacement. They weren't trying to annihilate a people group. They were moving people out of the land. Now you might think, well, this doesn't seem right. Didn't we do that to the American Indians? Different context, different situation. You can't apply the same thing back upon the Old Testament. The fact of the matter is that the people in in this area were would not have thought it strange for this to happen. I mean, it was something that would fit within their worldview, within the way that they looked at societies. But let me move on to slavery for a moment, because I think that's another issue that we should deal with. This is a touchy issue because, as you probably know, there have been those in the past who have tried to justify slavery based upon the Bible. And once again, when anyone attempts to do this, or anyone attacks the credibility of the Bible by saying it promotes the immorality of slavery, we have to ask ourselves a question. Are we rightly understanding what the word slave or slavery meant in the Bible? And I don't think we are if we think that the slavery that the Bible is speaking about is what sometimes is called shackled slavery or antebellum slavery, which simply meant prior to the Civil War. The reality is that slavery in the Bible is more like indentured servitude than the shackled slavery that we as Americans are most familiar with due to our knowledge of our own history in our own country. So what is this antebellum slavery? Well, what could happen in this was a common thing in the ancient world, would be that someone may say someone has a farm or something. Someone is growing some crops and they have a bad crop, and so they basically end up owing money. Well, what they could do is they could hire themselves out to pay off that debt. They could perhaps even hire their whole family out. And when the debt was paid, then they were free from that. It was sort of like hiring yourself out for work. It was more like that than it was this notion of shackled slavery. In fact, I don't think it was anything like shackled slavery at all. So it was based upon a voluntary entrance into a contractual relationship with someone. Someone sells himself or sells one of his... And by the way, this is talked about in Leviticus 25, verse 47. One of your countrymen becomes poor and sells himself. He's trying to better himself. This is an attempt to try to bring yourself out of poverty because you're hiring yourself out to someone. Similar to the way an employee works for an employer. It's possible that, and this is a very interesting thing I think as well to bring out, because it's used as an analogy in the New Testament to Christ himself. When a person had a debt, if they were fortunate enough to have a kinsman who could actually pay the debt that they owed, it's referred to as redeeming that individual, paying the debt for that individual. That becomes something that's used in the New Testament to describe the redemption that we all have in Christ, because we had a debt as well with respect to God because of our sin. And Christ redeemed us. He paid the debt for us. He's in a sense, our kinsman redeemer. And of course, you know, there are a couple stories in the Old Testament that talk about that. So this is really what the Old Testament is referring to. It's this idea of indentured servitude. Now we could talk a lot more about it. There's a lot of passages that address this. The Old Testament law itself specifies how this is supposed to work. And by the way, after 6 years, you could only be in debt in this kind of service for so long before your employer, if I can use a modern term, would have to free you. When we look very carefully at the laws that were set down in the Torah for how this was supposed to work, we discovered that servants in Israel were to be treated with dignity. They were to be treated with dignity. So the laws indicate an attempt to regulate and control this, and it was not meant to idealize this. It was an attempt to help people. It wasn't wasn't that this was an ideal situation and that God wanted people to be in a state of slavery or servitude, because you were obviously in there because you were poor, because you had an economic problem or crisis. We know that the law specified for the poor that they could glean from fields at the corners of the field, and the owners of vineyards and so on were to leave a little bit left so that the poor could benefit from that as well. We also note that the laws specified that these servants were to be treated as persons and not property. This is extremely important to recognize, because when you examine the slavery laws that you find in other cultures in the ancient Near East, you find that these slaves were to be treated as property more than persons. And to make an illustration of that, or to give several illustrations of that, we can look at the fact that there were anti-harm laws that were given in the Old Testament. In other words, if a master harmed a servant, he was to release that servant. He was to release him. He accidentally poked his eye out or something like that. He was no longer to be a servant of that person. In fact, he was supposed to be compensated as well. This person was to be compensated. And by the way, I just might also add to this that when a master released a servant, he was to provide enough for that servant to take care of him for his well-being. You see, this kind of stuff was unheard of among the other nations. If you look at the Babylonian laws, you look at the Hittite laws, you look at them, this was good stuff compared to the other laws. This was nothing like those other cultures. There are also anti-kidnapping laws that are listed in the Torah as well, which if those so-called Christians who were involved in the slave trade in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, would have taken a close look at, they should have been able to recognize that this would have been completely contrary to the Bible to go and kidnap people and force them into slavery. But the Bible has anti-kidnapping laws, and the Bible also has laws for providing safe harbor for runaway slaves. Now, if you were harboring a slave in another culture, you would probably be killed for that. But the Old Testament provided for helping runaway slaves from other cultures and providing safe harbor for them. So, very clearly, these laws stand above and beyond what we find in the surrounding cultures. Once again, I don't think it was idealizing slavery or servanthood, but working with, the tragedies that people perhaps would end up finding themselves in, and trying to regulate this so that there weren't abuses that would take place. Again, Paul Copeland goes into great detail in his book, going over these various laws and giving lots of good examples. Any questions on that? I know I'm just touching on these things. Yes, there's a mic right there.
We certainly realize, I think, that the Bible essentially was, when God gave the inspiration of the Bible or the scriptures, was based on moral law. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then how did we get to the point after the scriptures were written that certain persons or certain groups of individuals were using it as a justification for slavery?
Using the Bible. Well, I think that based upon what I just said, the answer to that question is they weren't reading their Bibles correctly. Or they were doing what a lot of people do, picking and choosing, sort of the cafeteria approach to the Bible. I like this, I don't like that.
At a heightened level at one point,
Absolutely.
And,
Yes.
I just don't believe that everybody was not reading their Bible correctly.
Well, again, it also could have been misinterpreting the Bible as well. I mean, one of the things we're learning is how important it is to read the Bible in its context. So if someone doesn't know the context and they see that word slave, then perhaps they can draw the wrong conclusion that that's talking about the same sort of slavery that they are looking at in a different time period. And again, as I pointed out, they're committing the fallacy of presentism because they're applying a present idea onto the past, anachronistically onto the past, and failing to read very carefully. I mean, like I said, the Bible is not a lazy man's book, and you have to study it carefully. And I think if we read the Bible carefully, we can figure this stuff out. It's not as hard as sometimes it seems, because, like I said, if you look carefully at the laws that are laid down, even in the Torah for how these servants are to be treated, I don't know how someone can look at that and think that in any way is justifying the type of slavery that was going on in America and in Great Britain for a period of time as well, that shackled form of slavery. I mean, just how they were treated like property. And yet, in the Torah, if a master killed one of his slaves, it's the death penalty for him. You see, so that's showing the dignity that the Torah held for a servant or a slave. You see.
But before Great Britain and before all that, the Muslims, they weren't reading the Bible. And they were, spreading slavery all over the place. Well, they're going to read their own thing. They're not reading the book.
Well,
so
they have their own book.
That would be assuming that everybody, to say they weren't following the Bible.
Right.
The Muslims were not. They were.
Yeah, well, there's the difference between the Torah and Sharia law.
Yeah.
And, we don't follow Sharia law.
That shouldn't have been a need for the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah, right.
Well, that's another discussion. There were.
But there's also, obviously as it relates to American slavery, not what was going on in other parts of the world. But it was also the reference, this is a question, isn't it true that there's also the reference to the three nations, the reference coming out of from Noah, his sons, and Ham being one of the descendants, and the interpretation that the sons of Ham should operate as servants to the others. And so just but I think basically the bottom line is it just goes to the heart of man. They weren't reading the Bible, they were misinterpreting the Bible, they were picking and choosing, like you say, with the cafeteria approach, what fits and suits what I'm trying to accomplish.
Sure.
And it just gets back to the heart of man. And so,
right.
In retrospect, certainly we know it was all wrong, but at the time it was what the evil heart of man constructed to serve its own purposes.
Sure. Yes. Thank you.
I did think it was interesting in the book where he talked about that the indentured slavery was a way to keep. God provided a way for the Jewish people to take care of themselves and to eat, and to live and to be in a place where they're taken care of,
right.
until they work that off and go their own way. And so I thought that was interesting that he talked about that in the book because, and it made a lot of sense that they weren't being paid for what they were doing. Mm-hmm. They were having a place and they were getting food and
right.
taken care of in that way. And I thought that was wonderful
mm-hmm.
that God had provided for that.
Absolutely.
In that way
yes.
for his people.
Yes. Good. Thank you for raising that. That's good. Anything else? I want to move on to the angry God criticism. And Dr. Chris, you feel free to jump in anytime you want. All right. Well, I guess the question, the way I have this question posed, and by the way, let me just say this real quick. I do have PowerPoint slides for all of these talks, and I will upload them on the Blackboard, and so you can have access to them. I'll probably upload them in the form of a PDF document so that you can just scroll right down through them. But they will be made available, and if you're not in the class and you still want them, you can send me an email and I'll attach them to my response. So the question is, why is God so angry? I touched on this the other night, but I want to just remind you of it again. The approach of the German higher critics that proposed that there were two gods presented in the Bible: the Old Testament God, who's angry, jealous, vengeful, and so on, the God of the Old Testament, and then the loving, kind, forgiving, merciful God of the New Testament. And I gave you the examples from Jonah 4 and Matthew 5, and I wanted to give you two more examples that illustrate that this particular approach is flawed. And the first one comes from Ezekiel chapter 18. And I'll read a couple verses for you. I referenced this verse. I paraphrased it last time, but I'd like to read a few verses here from the text so that you can get a sense of this. Ezekiel 18, I'll begin in verse 21. Now, if the wicked person turns from all the sins he has committed, keeps all my statutes, and does what is just and right, he will certainly live, he will not die. None of the transgressions he has committed will be held against him. He will live because of the righteousness he has practiced. Now listen to this. Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked? This is the declaration of the Lord. Instead, do I take pleasure when he turns from his ways and lives? You see what God is saying through the mouth of the prophet. God really doesn't want people to perish. He really doesn't want them to come under judgment. It's not his desire. He doesn't take pleasure in that. I think this indicates that God is not this wrathful God, this angry God that the German higher critics tend to try to make him out to be. God's desire is that people should live. His desire is that they should turn from their wicked ways. So what is the problem? It's their wicked ways. It's like, think of it this way. Those of you who have raised or are raising children, you get this probably better than anybody does. I remember when my oldest son was 2 years old. We lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was when I was in seminary. And he had learned how to walk by then, obviously. And we moved into a home that was on a fairly busy road in Charlotte. It was actually in one of the suburbs of Charlotte. And we would, take my son outside to play. I'd take him outside to play. And he had this habit of just taking off, running. I mean, this is, for a little kid, this is a new thing. He can just run, just go. Well, sometimes he'd go towards the road out front where the busy traffic was. And I would yell at him, "Don't, come back, Alex, come back, stop." And he wouldn't listen to me. He would just keep on going. Well, I found that I had to apply some discipline in order to get the point across to him that this was something he shouldn't do. And I know some people don't believe in spanking their kids. It's a controversial thing these days. Well, I don't. Yeah, I do spank my kids because it works. I don't enjoy doing it. It's not something I take pleasure in.
I'm a mandated reporter, so.
Yeah, I know. I'm being recorded here. But here's the thing. My son learned that if he didn't hearken to my voice and stop, that a painful event was going to happen. But it was much less painful than the event that would happen if he didn't listen to me. You see, he just could not yet understand. He didn't have the ability to understand that not listening to me would bring him greater harm, and he could run out in the road and be killed. He just could not understand that. But what he could understand was that when he heard my voice and didn't stop, that he was going to there's going to be a painful consequence to that. And now, that's the only thing I could do. And what am I going to do? Sit him down and, now, son, let me tell you about why you shouldn't run out to the... No, he's not going to be able to comprehend this, you see. And a lot of times, we may not understand a particular command or law in the Bible, but God knows us better than we know ourselves, and He created us in His image, and His desire is good for us. He wants the best for us, you see. And so His commands are not arbitrary. He's trying to keep us from bringing harm upon ourselves, and that's what I believe is going on in this passage and throughout the Bible. God wants people to live. He doesn't take pleasure in the judgment that comes upon people. He doesn't take pleasure in their deaths. It's not His desire at all. Luke 19. And this is, by the way, I hope you're getting this. It's a failure of the critics to recognize what the entire Bible is teaching. They're not reading it to get that. Okay? In verse 41, Jesus is approaching Jerusalem. As He approached and saw the city, He wept over it, saying, "If you knew this day what would bring peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For the days will come on you when your enemies will build an embankment against you, surround you, and hem you in on every side. They will crush you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave one stone on another in you, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." Now, there's a lot we could say about this passage, about that statement, but I want you to see Jesus is approaching the city, and what's it say? He wept over it. He knew what was coming. He wasn't happy about the judgment that was going to come upon them. It wasn't His desire for that to happen, but it was going to happen nonetheless. It's not no good father would take pleasure in having to discipline his or her child. If anybody does, that's not a good parent. It's not a good parent. We do it because we have to. We're trying to instill in our children what is good for them. As I said the other night, we need to understand this correctly. God is not an emotional misfit. And I would suggest to you that emotions that are attributed to God in the Bible are probably more often than not anthropomorphic in their application to God. In other words, they're referring to the effects as experienced by humans more than anything else. I mean, when you were a kid, I know when I was afraid of my dad. I think I mentioned this the other night when I would be disobedient when my dad was at work. My mom would say, and it usually worked, "I'm going to tell your father what you did when he gets home," and that would bring fear in me. And as a child, I could very easily have thought of my dad as an angry person, as angry, but he really wasn't angry. It's just that's how I experienced his punishment, you see. But he was punishing me because he loved me, you see. And so I think that when the biblical writers are describing things such as the wrath of God, I think they are describing the effects of disobedience that God has, in a way, built into the universe. After all, He's a God of order. He created an ordered universe. And the reason why the universe is disordered now is because of sin, disobedience. We've created patterns of disorder, chaos. You see, that's what sin did. And I believe this is, I've often found this helpful in talking about what the fall, the effects of the fall in the world are. Paul says that when Adam sinned, he introduced sin into the world. He brought death and destruction. This is what we inherit as a result of that, because the patterns of that resonate. One day God's going to stop that, you know. And as people of God, as believers in Christ, we get our example from Christ, how to bring order out of that chaos that's there. That's what I believe the laws of God are doing. They're teaching us how to bring order, minimizing the amount of destruction and evil and chaos that we can bring about in the world. So I think wrath refers primarily to the objective, intrinsic consequences of sin in God's creative order as God's judgment. That's what I think, that when the Bible speaks about God's wrath, that's what it's talking about. It's sort of built in, you know, into the creative order. So rather than thinking of God as having conniption fits in heaven, I think we need to understand this in this perspective, and it will go a long way in providing explanatory power and an apologetic for what's really going on. Once again, I am only briefly touching on these subjects, and if anybody wants more resources on them, I can very easily get them for them. Your bibliography, by the way, that I sent out to you weeks ago, you might find a lot of those works helpful as well. And I know Dr. Crisp has some recommended works that he could give you too. All right, I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions before we wrap it up. We've been about an hour now, and I'd be glad to go on if I need to. But again, I'm touching on things in these little talks. Yes?
The statement in the Bible that says the thoughts of God is not the thoughts of man. And knowing that our emotions are derived from the way in which we think. We have our emotions based upon our thought patterns. We think about something and we generate feelings. Mm-hmm. As a result of that comes, our behaviors, our actions. So, looking at that, we could establish that the way God thinks is very different from the way in which we think. So hence the emotions that we have definitely cannot be substantially equal to the, let's say if God have emotions, would be a different type of emotional sort of expression, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, but the passage, yeah, you could be right about that. But I think the passage you're referencing, is it in Ezekiel? My thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. Yeah, that's a verse that's often taken out of context too, because if you read it in context, what God is really communicating there is that the people of Israel, they need to align their thoughts with God's thoughts. They need to align their ways with God's ways. Some people read that verse and think that this means God is so utterly beyond our comprehension, we couldn't possibly understand Him and His ways or His thoughts. But I think the exact opposite is what's being communicated in that passage. He's saying to the people that they need to think like He does. They need to act like He does. The problem is that their thoughts aren't His thoughts and their ways aren't His. That's their problem. And they need to realign. I mean, we believe that this is God's revelation, and it is. He wants us to know Him. And you ever wondered why when you read through the Torah, and David I think is talking about the Torah in Psalm 1, when he says, "In your law do I meditate day and night." Meditate day and night. In your law. I meditate day and night. Well, have you ever read the law? You ever read the books of Moses? It's tedious reading. So what in the world is David talking about? I think he understands that God's commands, His laws, are reflecting His nature. And you can know God through His commands. When the law becomes an end in itself, then we enter into legalism. But when we recognize that the law is a means to an end, it's teaching us about God, then it becomes enjoyable. Then that's why David can take pleasure in that. In your law do I meditate day and night makes sense, you see, because it's revealing who God is.
So we do have the capacity to.
Okay, let me. I know where you're going with that. let me qualify this a little more. I mean, I understand we can't fully comprehend God, but we can apprehend His commands sufficiently to know enough about Him to know what He wants from us and to know His will. We're not like Islam. Islam doesn't believe that you can know the nature of God. Christianity holds to essentialism, not, what's the word for that? Voluntarism. Essentialism is Christianity's view, not voluntarism. That's the Muslim view. Islam teaches voluntarism. Morality is what God wills, and that's it. And so morality can be arbitrary. You can't know God's nature through it, because God could will something different today than He willed yesterday. He could command something entirely different, which has a lot of explanatory power as to why a lot of Muslims do the things that they do. But Christianity and Judaism hold to essentialism. God's commands are not, God wills in accordance with His nature. His commands come from His will, but they are in accord with His nature, so they reflect His moral goodness, you see. So we can know God's nature. We can know that He is good, what goodness is, what righteousness is, through His law. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the difference. We can apprehend, maybe not. Some people make a distinction between apprehending and comprehending. Maybe that's helpful, I don't know.
Now, then, so can you expound a little bit more on the imagery of God?
On the what?
The image of God as it relates to us. I think that confuses a lot of people, and I think we kind of, tapped on that.
Well, yeah, I don't think we should take image in a very literal sense that God looks physically like us and all of that. That's a wrong way to view it. I think, it's a deep subject. I could only just briefly scratch the surface on it. Maybe Dr. Crisp could add something to this, but I take it as when God created man in the order of creation, man's the pinnacle, and God endows man with His image. And I think what that means, one of the things it means, is that we have capacities that are like God, that are reflective of God. And one of those things I've already mentioned, God brought order out of chaos. We can bring order out of chaos as well. We're moral beings, you see. We have certain creative capacities like God does. We are given dominion. None of the other creatures that God made are given dominion. I could go on and on. I think these are functional qualities that God has endowed us with that are reflective of Himself. He gives us the rational capacity so that we can, without that morality doesn't make sense. But because we create us with the ability to think, to reason, we are moral beings as a result of that. I don't think dogs and cats are moral beings. I don't think we can hold them to the moral law. But human beings, yes, we have that capacity. We are moral beings, and we can be held accountable for our actions. So, like I said, it's a deep subject. You could say a lot more about it. Maybe Dr. Crisp would say something too on that.
I can give you some passages to look at that may cause you to search the Scriptures more deeply. There are I would encourage you to read what is said about renewing, the renewing of the image of God in the book of Ephesians and Colossians, where Paul talks about the new man, which is created again in righteousness and created in a certain knowledge. So I believe the image of God somehow has to do with and cannot be left out in our thinking about what that means in the image of God. It has something to do with righteousness, and it has something to do with a knowledge of who he is that was lost in the fall. And someone who has a great exegetical exposition of this is John MacArthur. And you can read his commentaries on the passages in Ephesians and Colossians that have to do with the image of God. And I think you will find it very enlightening and cause you to think through this biblically and scripturally. So that would be
Yes.
just an addition to what you had already said about it.
Yes, thank you.
Is that reconciled at all with the fruits of the Spirit?
You do?
That if we are in the image of God and we live out as best
Sure.
as we can the fruits of the Spirit, we in essence are living out a certain degree of the righteousness of God.
Right, sure. Mark?
Well, my question was answered about 5 minutes ago.
Oh, okay. All right.
I thought it was interesting that when you're talking about the kind of the war rhetoric and what they would say, and kind of boasting. When it talks about later in the book, when it talks about if a guy wanted to, they won the battle and they wanted to take one of the women home. Here they do all that boasting, but I thought it was really interesting that they were strict to follow that month that they brought her into the house, and she was allowed to mourn her, her not being with her family and her
Right.
people and everything, and that they couldn't mistreat her, and they had to give her a month, and so they were respecting her
Right.
in that way. I thought that was really interesting that they'd go out and have a battle, and we slaughtered them, but yet I'm going to take this woman. I'm going to take good care of her, though. I'm going to bring her home, and I'm going to have her as my wife. I'm going to wait a month, and I thought that they would follow that, and they were serious about it.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I think the provisions in the law are reflective of the dignity that the whole Bible places with respect to human beings. It didn't matter if you were an Israelite or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for putting up with me again tonight, and we'll hopefully do this again very soon. And we'll look forward to tomorrow's events. Thank you.